My father has never once told me he was proud of me. Not when I graduated top of my class. Not when I landed my first real job. Not when I showed up to every single family gathering, smiled through every backhanded comment, and swallowed every humiliation like it was just part of the meal. But the night he stood up at my grandmother's birthday dinner, pointed at me in front of 60 people and shouted, that I was an embarrassment to the Sutherland name, that was the night something in me stopped bending. I didn't cry. I didn't shout back. I just looked at him, set my napkin on the table and said, "Okay, Dad." 2 words. He thought that meant he'd won. He always did. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days later, a lawyer named Edmund Greer would show up at his front door holding an envelope my father never knew existed. And everything Victor Sutherland had spent 30 years building on top of my silence was about to come apart in his hands. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I want to say something first. If you've ever been the person in your family who gets talked over, dismissed, or made to feel like you're too much and never enough at the same time, this story is for you. And if it resonates, consider subscribing. I share stories like this one for people who need to hear that the quiet ones don't stay quiet forever. Now let me take you back to where this really started. Not the dinner. Not the shouting. Further back than that. Back to a Tuesday morning in October when my grandmother, Vera Sutherland, had a stroke in her kitchen in Lakeford, Michigan, and the first crack appeared in a foundation my father had been standing on for decades. Vera Sutherland was 79 years old, sharp as a tack, and the only person in our family who ever made me feel like I belonged in the room. She was the kind of woman who remembered the exact date of every grandchild's first step, who kept a garden in the backyard of her Lakeford home so immaculate it looked like something out of a magazine, and who could silence my father with a single look from across a dinner table. She'd built her life carefully, deliberately, and on her own terms, something I'd spent my entire adult life trying to learn how to do myself. I was 27 years old and living in a 1-bedroom apartment on the east side of Lakeford when my aunt called me that morning. My name is Leora Sutherland. I work as a graphic designer for a mid-sized branding firm downtown. I make decent money, I pay my own rent, and I have built a quiet, steady life that my father has spent years describing to relatives as fine, for someone without real ambition. The call came at 7:52 in the morning while I was eating toast over my kitchen sink. My Aunt Diane's voice was thin and careful. "It's Grandma Vera, Leora. You need to come." I drove to Lakeford General in 20 minutes. My father was already there when I arrived, standing in the hallway outside the ICU in a pressed charcoal blazer, arms crossed, jaw set, the same expression he wore in every high-stakes situation. Controlled, deliberate, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Victor Sutherland is 61 years old. He ran a regional real estate development firm for 30 years before selling it for a number that made local news. He is tall, broad-shouldered, and speaks in the measured cadence of a man who has never once doubted that the room belongs to him. Beside him stood my brother, Caden, 32, dark jacket, arms folded in an unconscious mirror of my father's posture, the way he'd been mirroring him since we were children. They looked at me when I came through the door. My father gave a single nod. Caden said nothing. I went and stood near the window at the far end of the hall and waited for the doctor alone. Grandma Vera survived the stroke. But the doctors were cautious. There was some cognitive impact, they said. Short-term memory. Fatigue. She'd need monitoring, rest, and time. What they didn't say, but what I understood from the look on my father's face as he spoke quietly with the attending physician, was that the clock had shifted. Something about the way Victor Sutherland straightened his shoulders when the doctor used the word estate told me that my father's mind had already moved somewhere past the hospital room. I stayed with Grandma Vera that afternoon while my father and Caden went to handle what my father called administrative matters. She held my hand from her hospital bed, her grip surprisingly firm, her eyes clear and present despite everything. She looked at me for a long moment the way she always did when she was about to say something she meant completely. "Leora," she said quietly, "I've made arrangements. Everything is in order. Edmund knows what to do." I didn't know who Edmund was. I nodded anyway because something in her voice told me this wasn't the moment for questions. "You trust me?" she asked. I told her I did. She closed her eyes and the lines in her face softened. "Good girl," she said. "Good girl." That was the last real conversation I had with my grandmother before everything shifted. Over the following 6 weeks, Grandma Vera recovered slowly at home, cared for by a hired nurse my father arranged and paid for, something he mentioned at every family gathering as though it were a debt we were all accumulating. He visited twice a week. Caden visited once. I came every other day after work, sitting with her in the sunroom off the back of her Lakeford house, reading to her from the gardening books she loved, making her chamomile tea the way she liked it, no sugar, a slice of lemon pressed against the rim. We didn't talk much about the future. We talked about soil and perennials and the proper way to overwinter a rosebush. It was the most peaceful I had felt in years. Then November arrived, and with it my grandmother's 79th birthday dinner, and the night that changed everything. My father organized it. Of course he did. He booked the private dining room at Harrington's, a restaurant in downtown Lakeford with dark wood paneling, white linen tablecloths, and a wine list that existed to make people feel like they'd arrived somewhere important. He invited 60 people. Family, business associates, neighbors, people I hadn't seen in years and wouldn't have recognized on the street. I wore a navy dress I'd altered myself. I drove there alone and arrived on time, which in the Sutherland family somehow always manages to feel like arriving late. The dinner was fine for the first hour. Grandma Vera sat at the head of the table in pale gray, her silver hair set neatly, looking better than she had in weeks. My father moved through the room the way he always did at events he'd organized, working the tables, laughing at the right moments, the generous patriarch in his natural habitat. Then the speeches began. He stood with his wine glass raised and spoke about the Sutherland legacy, about strength and continuity, about how proud he was of the family his mother had built. He mentioned Caden by name 3 times. He mentioned Caden's recent promotion and his new house on the north side of Lakeford. He mentioned my mother once, briefly. He did not mention me at all. Then my Aunt Diane raised her glass and said, "And to Leora, who has been here every other day caring for Vera. We see you, sweetheart." A few people nodded warmly. I felt the kindness of it start to reach me. And then my father laughed. Not a warm laugh. The kind that reframes something genuine as something foolish without using a single mean word. "Leora's been very devoted," he said, his voice carrying across the room. Of course, devotion and direction aren't the same thing, are they? Some of us are still figuring out which roads actually lead somewhere. Polite laughter rippled across the tables and I felt every bit of it. I should have let it go. I had let it go 1,000 times before. But something about the way Grandma Vera's face tightened at the head of the table, something between grief and quiet resolve, made me speak before I'd decided to. "I'm doing just fine, Dad," I said clearly and calmly. "I always have been." The room went still. My father turned to look at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly spoken. Then he pointed at me from across that long white linen table in front of 60 people, his voice rising sharply. "Don't you dare take that tone with me at your grandmother's table. You want to talk about doing fine? Let's talk about what you've actually built, Leora. Let's talk about what the Sutherland name means to you beyond showing up." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. 60 faces. Some shocked. Some carefully neutral. Some already looking away. I did not cry. I sat very straight, folded my hands in my lap and said 2 words. "Okay, Dad." Then I excused myself, walked to the restroom and stood at the sink with cold water running over my wrists until my face stopped burning. I dried my hands, walked back out, finished my dinner and drove home in complete silence. That night I sat at my kitchen table in the dark for a long time. And then I remembered what my grandmother had said 6 weeks earlier, her grip firm, her eyes clear. "Edmund knows what to do." I opened my laptop and I started looking for a man named Edmund Greer. I found Edmund Greer in under 10 minutes. His name came up on the first search page. A solo practice attorney based out of a modest office building on Callaway Street in downtown Lakeford, specializing in estate planning and trust law. His headshot showed a man in his mid-60s, close-cropped gray hair, wire-framed glasses, and the kind of quiet, steady expression that belongs to someone who has spent a career sitting across from people in the worst moments of their lives. I stared at the photo for a long time. Then I closed the laptop without calling. I want to be honest about why I didn't call that night. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something older than fear, something my father had been installing in me since I was a child. The voice that says, "What if you're wrong? What if you make a move and it turns out to be nothing, and then you've exposed yourself for no reason?" I'd heard that voice my whole life. It had kept me seated at tables where I should have stood up. It had kept me silent in rooms where I should have spoken. That night I let it win one more time. I told myself I'd call in the morning. Then I went to bed and stared at the ceiling until almost 3 a.m. The morning brought something I wasn't expecting. I was getting ready for work, still half asleep, when my phone buzzed with an email notification. The sender was my brother Caden. Except it wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to our father, and I was CC'd by accident. His thumb must have slipped on his phone contacts because my name sits one entry above Dad in his list. The subject line read, Estate restructuring, next steps. My coffee went cold on the counter while I read it. The email chain went back 11 days. 11 days of messages between Caden and my father that I was never supposed to see. The language was careful, the way lawyers write when they're trying to sound reasonable while doing something that isn't. Caden had drafted a formal request to have Grandma Vera's existing estate documents reviewed and, in his words, updated to reflect the family's current structure and contributions. The petition named Caden as the primary beneficiary of Vera Sutherland's estate. It cited my grandmother's recent stroke as evidence of her diminished capacity to manage her own affairs. And in the third message down, in a line so casual it made my stomach turn, my brother had written to my father, Lyra won't even know to ask. He never does. I stood in my kitchen in my work clothes for a very long time. Then I screenshot every single message in the chain, emailed them to myself from 3 different accounts, and saved them to a thumb drive I kept in my desk drawer. I was 20 minutes late to work that day and sat at my desk staring at my design files without seeing a single one of them. That afternoon I called Edmund Greer's office. A woman answered, calm and professional, and asked for my name. When I gave it, there was a brief pause. Not the pause of someone searching for information, but the pause of someone who had been waiting for a specific name to appear. Miss Sutherland, she said, Mr. Greer has been expecting your call. Can you come in tomorrow morning? My hand tightened on the phone. I said yes. Edmund Greer's office was exactly what his headshot had suggested. Practical, organized, without any of the theatrical displays of success that lawyers sometimes use to justify their billing rates. Bookshelves lined 2 walls filled with legal texts and accordion folders. He shook my hand and gestured to the chair across from his desk without wasting time. Your grandmother retained me 9 years ago, he said. She came to me shortly after your grandfather passed, when she realized your father had begun making assumptions about how her estate would be distributed. She was extremely clear about what she wanted and equally clear about why she hadn't told your father directly. She said, and I'm paraphrasing, that men like Victor don't respond to conversations. They respond to documents. He opened a leather folder and slid a single page across the desk toward me. At the top, in clean formal typeface, it read, Last Will and Testament of Vera Louise Sutherland. Halfway down the page, highlighted in pale yellow, was my name. Leora N. Sutherland, sole primary beneficiary. I read it twice. Then I looked up at Edmund Greer. He was watching me with the patient expression of a man who had done this before and understood that some things need a moment to land. He explained it carefully without rushing. The will was current, properly witnessed and filed with the county. It had been updated twice since the original. Once 4 years ago and once 14 months ago. The most recent update made just before my grandmother's health began to decline in a way she apparently saw coming before any of us did. The estate included the family home on Birchwood Lane in Lakeford, a property my grandmother had purchased with money inherited from her own mother long before she married my grandfather. It also included a savings account with a balance of just over $480,000, accumulated over decades from the sale of a small textile business Vera had built and run herself in her 40s. A business, Edmund told me, that my father had always referred to as her little hobby. There's something else, Edmund said. He reached into the folder and produced a sealed envelope with my name on the front in my grandmother's handwriting, careful, slightly shaky, unmistakably hers. She asked me to give this to you in person, he said. Only you. I didn't open it there. I tucked it into my bag and held it the way you hold something fragile, aware of its weight even through the leather. Edmund continued. He told me that 3 weeks earlier, a petition had been filed with the probate court by my father, acting on Caden's behalf, requesting that Vera Sutherland's will be set aside on the grounds of cognitive incapacity at the time of its most recent amendment. The petition claimed my grandmother had been in mental decline when she signed the update 14 months ago and therefore the document could not be considered valid. Edmund's jaw tightened slightly when he said the next part. What the petition failed to mention was that your grandmother had undergone a full neurological assessment 1 week before signing that amendment. Her physician, Dr. Carolyn Marsh, documented the results in writing. Vera scored in the top percentile for her age group. By every measurable standard, she was sharper than most people half her age. He placed the medical report on the desk beside the will. Your father filed that petition knowing this evaluation existed, Edmund said. He filed it anyway. I exhaled slowly. Edmund told me that because the will was properly executed and the competency evaluation was on record, the petition had very little legal standing. But my father had filed it quietly without notifying me, and the court had not yet ruled. There was a window, Edmund explained, in which my father and Caden were hoping to push the petition through before I became aware of my grandmother's actual wishes. He folded his hands. The question is what you would like to do about it. I thought about Caden's email. Leora won't even know to ask. She never does. I thought about my father's voice carrying across 60 people at that dinner table. I thought about my grandmother in her hospital bed, grip firm, eyes clear. Edmund knows what to do. I want to fight it, I said. Edmund nodded once. Then he walked me through the next steps with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this specific conversation for a long time, because he had. He would file a formal response to the petition. He would submit the competency evaluation as primary evidence. He would also request that the court compel full disclosure of all communications between my father and Caden regarding the estate, which meant the email chain I'd screenshot was about to become significantly more useful than I'd realized. He told me one more thing before I left. The family home on Birchwood Lane. I need you to understand what that property represents. Your grandmother purchased it in 1979 with her own inheritance. Your father's name has never appeared on that deed. Not once. He believes it will pass to him by default. Edmund looked at me over his glasses. It will not. I drove home in the kind of quiet that feels different from the quiet on the way there. When I got back to my apartment, I made tea, sat at the kitchen table and opened my grandmother's envelope. Inside was a single page, handwritten front and back, in the same careful shaky ink I recognized on the outside. Leora, she had written. If you are reading this, then Edmund has done what I asked and you are sitting somewhere trying to make sense of all of it. I imagine you are also trying to decide whether the fight is worth it. Let me save you the time. It is. I have watched you your entire life carry the weight of this family's approval like it was something you owed them. You don't owe them anything, my darling. You never did. What I am leaving you is not a reward. It is a correction. The house, the money, all of it. I built those things quietly without anyone making speeches about it or raising a glass in my honor. And I am leaving them to the person in this family who understands what it means to build something quietly and keep going anyway. That is you. It has always been you. Don't let them tell you otherwise, and don't let them take what I worked my whole life to give you. I love you more than I ever knew how to say out loud. Go show them who you are. All my love, Grandma Vera. I folded the letter back into its envelope and pressed it flat against my chest. Outside the window, the first snow of the season was coming down over Lakeford in slow, deliberate flakes, settling on rooftops and bare trees and the street below like something being covered carefully so that something else could start fresh underneath. I sat there for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called Edmund Greer. I'm ready, I said. Let's start. 3 weeks passed between the morning I called Edmund Greer and said I was ready and the morning things actually started moving. 3 weeks of going to work, opening design files, eating dinner alone at my kitchen table while the snow outside kept falling on Lakeford like it had somewhere to be. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath, everything was coiling. Edmund filed the formal response to my father's petition on a Wednesday. He sent me a copy by email with a short note. Filed this morning. The court has 30 days to schedule a hearing. Your father will be notified that a counter-response has been submitted. Be prepared for what happens when he finds out, you know. I read that last sentence 3 times. I had been preparing for it my whole life without knowing that's what I was doing. My father called me on a Friday evening 4 days after Edmund's filing. I stood at the stove and watched my phone ring. I let it go to voicemail. He didn't leave one. Caden called 20 minutes later. I let that go too. Then my mother called and I answered because my mother has never in her life called me to deliver a threat. She called to warn me about them. Leora, her voice was careful, clipped in the way it got when she was delivering a message she hadn't written. Your father wants to know what you think you're doing. He says his attorney contacted him today about some kind of counterfiling and he wants to talk to you before this goes any further. I stirred my soup and said nothing. Mom, do you know what Dad filed with the probate court 3 weeks ago? A long pause. Something about the estate. He said it was routine. It isn't routine, I said. He filed a petition to remove me as Grandma Vera's beneficiary without telling me. He told the court he had tried to reach me. He hadn't. Another pause, longer this time, and in it I could hear my mother rearranging something in her understanding of the past 3 weeks. I didn't know that, she said quietly. I know, I told her. That's the point. She called back an hour later. Whatever you're planning, she said, your father is not going to take this quietly. I already know that, Mom. I hung up and finished my soup. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. There is something deeply relieving about moving from dreading a thing to simply doing it. The hearing was scheduled for the second week of December, 15 days away. Edmund and I met twice more in his office on Callaway Street, going over everything with the same systematic precision he applied to everything. The will. The competency evaluation. Dr. Carolyn Marsh's medical report. The email chain, now formally submitted as evidence of coordinated intent to defraud a named beneficiary. He also showed me a property record pulled from the county assessor's office. Deed history on the Birchwood Lane home going back to 1979. My grandmother's name appeared on every single line. My father's name appeared nowhere. When your father learned about the hearing date, Edmund told me during our second meeting, his attorney contacted my office requesting a private settlement discussion. He wants to resolve this before it becomes public record. I looked at him. What does that mean exactly? It means he wants to offer you something in exchange for dropping the counterfiling and walking away from the estate. Edmund slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. This is the offer his attorney put in writing this morning. I picked it up. My father was offering me $40,000 and a letter of apology in exchange for my full withdrawal from the estate proceedings and a signed agreement that I would not pursue any further legal action related to Vera Sutherland's assets. $40,000. Out of an estate worth well over $500,000, plus a property appraised at $320,000. My father had done the math and decided that was what I was worth. What was more interesting to me was what the offer confirmed. He was scared. Victor Sutherland did not offer settlements when he believed he was going to win. He offered settlements when he understood finally that the ground beneath him was not as solid as he thought. I set the paper back on Edmund's desk. Tell his attorney no. Edmund nodded like he'd expected nothing else. Then he said something that reframed the next 2 weeks for me entirely. There is one more thing I think you should know before the hearing. Your grandmother did something I've only seen a handful of times in 30 years of estate law. He opened his leather portfolio again and produced a document I hadn't seen in our previous meetings. It was a letter, formal, signed, and notarized, addressed to the presiding judge of the Lakeford Probate Court. Vera Sutherland had written it herself 14 months ago, the same week she amended her will and the same week she underwent her cognitive evaluation. In it she described her wishes plainly in her own words without legal language. She wrote about who she was leaving her estate to and why. She wrote about the nature of the family dynamics she had observed over decades. She named my father specifically. And she asked the court directly and by name, to ensure that her granddaughter Leora was protected from any attempt to circumvent her documented wishes. I read it slowly twice. My grandmother had not just planned ahead. She had anticipated every move my father would make and answered each one before he had made it. Edmund watched me read. She was a remarkable woman, he said simply. I nodded. I couldn't speak. The days between that meeting and the hearing had a particular texture I still remember clearly. I kept working. I kept showing up. I kept my apartment clean and my schedule full because I had learned a long time ago that the way to survive waiting is to fill the waiting with motion. My cousin Petra called me one evening, my father's niece through his younger sister, someone I had always been close to but rarely saw. Word travels in families the way water travels through old walls, slowly and then all at once. Petra said she'd heard something was happening with Grandma Vera's estate and she wanted me to know she was in my corner. I thanked her. She said one more thing before hanging up. He did the same thing to Aunt Sylvie when Uncle Mort died. He rearranged everything before anyone knew what was happening. Only Sylvie didn't fight it. I hung up and wrote her name in my notes because people who have seen the pattern before are people worth having in a room. The night before the hearing I drove to Birchwood Lane. I didn't plan to. I was driving home from the office and the route just curved in that direction the way familiar roads do when your hands know them better than your mind does. I parked across the street and sat looking at the house. 2 stories, white siding, a wide front porch with the hanging basket brackets my grandmother had installed the summer I was 12. The garden beds were covered in snow, the birch trees along the walk stripped bare, the whole property resting under winter the way things rest when they know spring is coming. The lights were off. My father had a key but he hadn't been staying there. This house on Birchwood Lane had always been a different thing entirely. It was the house where my grandmother made Sunday dinners that smelled like roasted garlic and wood smoke. It was the house where she taught me to sew a hem and read a plant tag. It was the house where she once told me when I was 16 and crying over something my father had said at a holiday dinner, that the loudest person in a room is almost never the most important one. I sat there for a while. Then I drove home, set my alarm for 6 and went to sleep. The hearing room at the Lakeford County Probate Court was smaller than I expected. Pale walls, fluorescent lighting, 2 long tables facing the judge's bench, designed for function and nothing else. Edmund and I sat at the table on the left. My father and his attorney, a man named Gerald Prost from a mid-size firm in the business district, sat at the table on the right. My father wore his charcoal blazer. He looked composed, unhurried, every inch the former businessman who had spent 30 years in rooms where other people made him nervous and he made them more nervous back. He didn't look at me when I came in. I didn't need him to. Caden was not present. I noticed that immediately. The son whose name had been on every petition, every email, every carefully worded legal maneuver of the past 2 months, had not shown up to the hearing. I found out later that his own attorney had advised him to absent himself. The email chain, once formally submitted as evidence, had made Caden's direct involvement a liability significant enough that distancing himself was the safer move. He had thrown my father into a courtroom and then stepped back out of range. I filed that away without comment. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Dunn, reviewed the submitted documents without expression, moving through them with the efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of this story and was interested only in what the papers said. Edmund presented each piece in sequence. The will. The competency evaluation. Dr. Marsh's medical report. The notarized letter my grandmother had written directly to the court. And finally, the email chain, printed with full metadata and highlighted at the line that had been living in my memory since the morning I first read it. Leora won't even know to ask. She never does. Judge Dunn read that line. She looked up from the paper. She looked at my father. He was looking at the table. For the first time since October, Victor Sutherland had nothing to say. Judge Patricia Dunn had the kind of face that gave nothing away while she was reading, which meant the entire room was running on its own anxiety with no external feedback to calibrate against. Gerald Prost, my father's attorney, sat very still with his hands folded on the table. My father had stopped looking at the table and was now looking at a fixed point on the wall slightly above and to the left of the judge's head. The posture of a man who has decided that projecting calm is the only card he has left to play. Edmund sat beside me with his portfolio closed, his pen capped, his hands still. He had said everything he needed to say. Now we waited. Judge Dunn set the last document down. She looked at Gerald Prost and asked him a single question. Does your client dispute the authenticity of any of the documents submitted by the petitioner's counsel? Prost shifted in his seat. He said that the petition had been filed in good faith based on concerns about the decedent's cognitive state at the time of the will's most recent amendment. Judge Dunn looked at him the way you look at someone who has answered a different question than the one you asked. I'll ask again, she said. Does your client dispute the authenticity of any documents submitted today? Pause. No, Prost said. We do not. What happened next took 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the judge's bench without blinking. Judge Dunn ruled that the petition filed by Richard Victor Sutherland to contest the validity of Vera Louise Sutherland's will was denied. She cited the competency evaluation, the physician's documentation, and what she called the absence of any credible evidentiary basis for the claim of cognitive incapacity. She ordered that the original will be recognized as the valid and binding expression of Vera Sutherland's final wishes. She also noted, in language that was measured and precise and left no interpretive room, that the court had reviewed the communications submitted as supplementary evidence and found them sufficient to warrant a referral to the State Bar for review of the conduct of any licensed attorneys involved in the drafting of the original petition. She looked at my father when she said that last part. He was still looking at the wall. Edmund and I walked out of the courthouse into a December afternoon so cold the air had a physical edge to it. He shook my hand on the steps, firm and brief the way he did everything. "You held up well in there," he said. I told him I hadn't had to do much. He smiled, which was one of the few times I'd seen him do it. "Your grandmother did most of the work years ago," he said. "You just showed up to receive it." He told me he would handle the remaining paperwork. The deed transfer on Birchwood Lane, the account notifications, the formal closure of the contested petition. 2 to 3 weeks for everything to be processed. Then he went back to his car and I stood on the courthouse steps alone in the cold for a moment, watching traffic move past, feeling something I didn't have an immediate word for. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter. The end of a very long-held breath. My father didn't speak to me after the hearing. He walked out of the courthouse with Gerald Prost and went in the other direction without looking back. That was fine. I hadn't gone there for a conversation. What I hadn't anticipated was Caden. 3 days after the ruling, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It took me a moment to realize it was his work phone. He had used his personal number before, but after the bar referral his attorney had likely advised him to treat every communication as a potential exhibit. The text was 8 words. "I need to talk to you. Please call." I sat with it for 2 days. Then I called, not because I owed him a conversation but because I believed and still believe that you cannot know what someone means to do with the future unless you give them at least one moment to show you. He answered on the second ring. He sounded different, tired, like someone who had spent 3 days in the company of consequences and found it humbling. He said he was sorry. He said it plainly, without the architecture of justification I had learned to expect from Sutherland men when they were forced into apology. "I drafted that petition," he said. "I told myself it was practical. That you weren't equipped for that kind of money, that kind of responsibility. But that wasn't why I did it." He paused. "I did it because Dad asked me to and I've never in my life said no to him. Not once. And I think I've been paying for that longer than I realized." I listened without interrupting. When he finished I said, "I appreciate you telling me that. And I meant it. But I also said an apology doesn't undo the filing, Caden. The bar referral is going to go where it goes regardless of this conversation." He said he understood. He said he wasn't calling to change any of that. He just wanted me to know that what he had written in that email, the line about me never fighting anything, he had known it was wrong the moment he typed it. He'd sent it anyway. That, he said, was what he was most ashamed of. I told him I heard him. We hung up. I didn't call him back after that, but I didn't close the door either. I left it the way you leave a window cracked in early spring. Not open enough to let in the cold, but enough to let in some air. My father was a different matter entirely. He called once, 9 days after the ruling, on a Sunday morning. I answered. He spoke for 4 minutes without pausing. He told me I had embarrassed the family. He told me I had weaponized my grandmother's grief against my brother. He told me that what I had done in that courtroom was not justice, it was spite, and that he hoped I was satisfied with myself. His voice never cracked. He never lost the cadence of a man who is absolutely certain of his own position. When he finished, I waited a beat and then said quietly and without heat, "Are you done?" He didn't answer. I said, "I didn't take anything from you, Dad. Grandma gave what was hers to whoever she chose. You just assumed it was yours without asking." He hung up. I set my phone on the table and watched the snow come down and felt nothing that resembled guilt. 2 weeks after the ruling, Edmund called to tell me the deed to the Birchwood Lane property had been formally transferred. He emailed me the updated county record with my name on the deed line and a 1-sentence note beneath it. "It's done." I printed the document and held it for a long time. This piece of paper that represented something so much larger than property. My grandmother had seen something in me that I had spent years trying to locate in myself, and she had bet everything on it with the kind of precision that takes not just love but genuine, steady, long-game belief. She had hired an attorney. She had documented her own mental competency. She had written a letter to a judge. She had left an envelope on a kitchen table in a cottage by the lake and trusted that I would find it. All of that so that when the moment came, my father could do nothing except stand in a courtroom and watch it hold. The bank account transfer took 3 more days. $481,000, moved into an account in my name at a Lakeford branch of the same bank my grandmother had used for 40 years. Patricia, the account manager who processed the transfer, had known my grandmother personally. She told me Vera had come in herself 2 years ago to update the beneficiary information and spent 20 minutes chatting with staff about the hydrangeas outside the front window. She was something else, Patricia said. She really was, I told her. I paid off every dollar of my outstanding student debt the following morning. I sat at my laptop at 6:30 a.m. and processed the payment with the satisfaction of someone closing a chapter that had been pressing against them for years. Then I opened a new document and started writing a business plan. Something I had been building in the back of my mind for 2 years without letting it feel real. A small independent design studio. My own client list. My own hours. My name on the door, which was also my grandmother's name in every way that mattered. I drove to Birchwood Lane on a Saturday morning in late December with a key Edmund had handed me across his desk and a thermos of coffee I'd made at home. The house was cold when I unlocked the front door, the kind of cold that settles into rooms that haven't been lived in for a while, but not unwelcoming. It smelled like cedar and old books and very faintly beneath everything like the lavender sachets my grandmother kept in every closet. I walked through each room slowly. The living room with the wide bay window. The kitchen where she had made 40 years of Sunday dinners. The sunroom where we had sat with chamomile tea and talked about gardens while the rest of the family talked about money. I stood in the sunroom with my coffee going cold and the winter light coming in flat and pale through the glass. Outside, the birch trees stood bare against the gray sky, patient the way trees always are, waiting for the season to give them back their leaves. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and thought about my grandmother standing in this same spot, looking out at this same garden, making her plans with the careful deliberate love of someone who knows that the most important things you give another person are rarely the things you say out loud. I hadn't expected what came next, because I thought the hard part was over. I thought the courtroom had been the ending. I was wrong. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in January, slipped through the mail slot of the Birchwood Lane house while I was in the kitchen making coffee. I had been staying there 3 nights a week by then, slowly moving between my apartment and the house the way you move into something new, carefully room by room giving yourself time to believe it's real. I heard the mail slot open and close and didn't think anything of it. Then I went to pick it up and saw my name on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. No return address. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. The message was short, typed and signed. You think this is over? It isn't. Your grandmother wasn't the saint you think she was. There are things about this family you don't know. If you want the truth, meet me at the Birchwood Diner on Clement Street at 9 a.m. Friday. Come alone. I read it twice, standing in the front hallway in my socks with my coffee going cold in my other hand. Then I set it on the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it for a long time. My first instinct was to call Edmund. My second instinct was to ignore it entirely. Both felt right and neither felt complete. Growing up in a family like mine, you develop a radar for manipulation. You learn to recognize moves designed to make you doubt yourself right when you finally stop doubting yourself. This letter had that shape. The question was whether the person who sent it had something real or whether this was my father working from a distance through a proxy. I called Edmund anyway. He listened without interrupting. When I finished he said I wouldn't ignore it. But I also wouldn't go alone. I told him I wasn't planning to. I asked him who he thought might have sent it. He was quiet for a moment. There is one person, he said carefully, who had access to your grandmother's personal history and who may feel that the outcome of the hearing left something unresolved. He paused. Your grandmother had a life before your grandfather, Leora. Before Victor. Before any of this. I've known certain things for years because she told me because she trusted me. But there are things she chose not to put in writing. I think it's possible that someone from that part of her life has surfaced. I sat with that. Then I asked him if what they had to say could change anything legally. No, he said. What's done is done. But you may want to hear it anyway. I went to the Birchwood Diner on Friday at 9:05. I brought my cousin Petra, who had offered weeks earlier to be in my corner, and who had the particular quality of being both warm and completely unintimidated by difficult situations. She sat in the booth behind mine with a cup of coffee and her phone and instructions to stay within eye line and say nothing unless I signaled her. The diner was quiet that time of morning. Booths upholstered in dark red vinyl, steam rising from the coffee station, the smell of bacon and dish soap and winter coats. I took a booth near the window and waited. She came in at 9:02. I knew her immediately, not because I'd seen her before but because she had my grandmother's posture. Straight-backed, deliberate, the walk of a woman who had spent a long time being certain of her own presence in rooms. She was somewhere in her mid-70s, silver hair cut short, a wool coat the color of slate. She slid into the seat across from me and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not hostile, not warm, something more complicated than either. "My name is Dorothea Crane," she said. "Your grandmother and I were friends for over 50 years. I want you to understand that I am not here to help your father. I am here because Vera asked me to come, in a manner of speaking." She paused. "And because I think you deserve to know the full shape of what she left you, not just the parts that fit neatly into legal documents." I said nothing. I folded my hands on the table and waited. Dorothea told me that she and my grandmother had met as young women in their 20s, working at the same textile firm where Vera would later build her own business from the ground up. They had been close in the way that women who survive the same difficult early years are close, not always in touch but permanently connected. She told me that before my grandmother married my grandfather, she had made a decision that she carried quietly for the rest of her life. She had been engaged to another man. A man named Robert Crane, Dorothea's younger brother. They had been together for 3 years. Robert had loved my grandmother completely and without reservation, and my grandmother had loved him back, and then she had ended it. Not because she stopped loving him, but because Robert was sick. A diagnosis in his late 20s, serious, uncertain in its trajectory, and my grandmother had made the calculation, the painful, private, devastating calculation, that she could not build a life on that foundation. She had walked away. She had married my grandfather 6 months later. Robert had survived his illness, lived another 40 years, never married anyone else, and died the previous spring at the age of 81. I looked at Dorothea. She was watching me steadily, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "I'm not telling you this to change how you feel about your grandmother," she said. "Vera was one of the finest people I have known. She made a choice that hurt my brother and she knew it and she carried it. What I am telling you is that in the last 2 years of her life, when she knew she was declining, she reached out to me. We spoke 4 times. And in the last conversation she told me something she asked me not to share until after everything with the estate was settled." Dorothea reached into her coat pocket and placed a small envelope on the table between us. "This is for you. She wrote it 8 months ago. She said you would understand it when the time was right." My name was on the front in my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized the stationery, the same cream-colored paper, the same faint watermark, the same blue ink pressed firmly enough to groove the page. I didn't open it at the table. I thanked Dorothea. I asked her why she had sent the unsigned note rather than simply contacting me directly. She gave a small dry smile. "Because I wasn't sure you'd come if you knew who it was from. I didn't know you. I needed to see what kind of person you were before I gave you what Vera asked me to give." I looked at her. "And?" She picked up her coffee. "You came alone," she said, "which means you're brave. You brought someone with you, which means you're not foolish. Vera would have approved." She put on her coat, left a $5 bill on the table for the coffee she'd barely touched, and walked back out into the January morning without looking back. Petra slid into the seat across from me the moment Dorothea cleared the door. "What was that?" she asked. I held up the envelope. "I don't know yet," I said. I drove back to Birchwood Lane and sat at the kitchen table and opened it the way I had opened every letter my grandmother had ever left me, slowly, carefully, as though the paper itself was something to be preserved. Inside was a single page, front only this time, the handwriting a little more effortful than the earlier letters, a little more deliberate, as though she had been choosing each word with particular care. "Leora," she had written. "If Dorothea has found you, then you know a part of me I kept private my whole life. I don't ask you to judge it. I only ask you to understand that the choices I made when I was young were made by someone who was afraid, and that fear is not the same as coldness, even when it looks like it from the outside. I built my life from that decision. Every business, every garden, every dollar I saved, every document I signed with Edmund, I built it all knowing that I had once chosen security over love and that I owed it to the life I'd chosen to make it mean something. What I want you to know now that the estate is settled and the people who tried to take it from you have been answered, is this. I did not leave you what I left you because you were the most convenient choice. I left it to you because of the morning I watched you transplant a rosebush in this garden when you were 9 years old, and you got it wrong the first time, and instead of crying or giving up you pulled it out of the ground and started over without being asked. That's who you are, Leora. You have always known how to start over. Everything I have given you is just soil. What you grow in it is yours entirely. All my love, always, Grandma Vera. I sat at the kitchen table in Vera Sutherland's house, my house, and let the tears come without trying to redirect them. Outside the window the birch trees stood in the January wind and the sky over Lakeford was the particular pale white that comes before snow. I thought about a woman who had spent 50 years building something from a decision she'd always questioned. I thought about how love sometimes expresses itself not in grand gestures but in decades of patient, unglamorous, carefully documented preparation. I thought about the rosebush. I had been 9 years old and I had gotten it wrong and I had started over without being asked. And my grandmother had been watching from the kitchen window and she had filed that moment away and carried it for 18 years until the moment she needed to know who to trust with everything she had. I folded the letter. I put it in my coat pocket with the others. Then I stood up, put the kettle on and started thinking about spring. Spring in Lakeford arrives without announcing itself. One morning the birch trees along the front walk are bare and the garden beds are crusted with the last of the frost. And then a week later something has shifted at the root level. Quietly underground where you can't see it, and the whole yard begins to move. I noticed it first in the corner bed along the back fence, where the soil had gone dark and loose from the composting I'd done in February. A line of green pushed through, thin as a thread, and I stood looking at it for a full minute before I understood what I was seeing. The peonies. My grandmother's peonies. They had survived 2 years of neglect and they were coming back. I knelt in the dirt in my work coat and pressed 2 fingers into the soil the way my grandmother had taught me, checking the temperature, the moisture, the give of it. The bed needed work. Aeration, fresh compost along the edges, a trim of the dead cane growth from last season, but the roots were there. Deep and intact and entirely unimpressed by everything that had happened above ground while they were quietly waiting. I stayed out there for an hour that morning before I even made coffee. There are worse ways to start a day. The months between January and April had been quieter than I expected, which is to say they had been full of work, of decisions, of the particular kind of forward motion that feels different from running away because you are choosing the direction. I had signed a lease on a studio space in the Millward Arts building on the east side of Lakeford. A converted warehouse with high ceilings and north-facing windows that let in the kind of light designers pay significant money to find. My name was on the door. Sutherland Design. I stood in front of it the morning the sign went up and felt something I can only describe as recognition. Not surprise, but something slotting into place that had always been meant to go there. I had 3 clients by February, 5 by March, and a waiting list forming by April. Word travels in small cities the way it always does, through personal recommendations, through the cousin who knows someone at a firm who heard you did excellent work on a commercial property on the north side. I was not doing anything radical or loud. I was doing what I had always done, which was show up and build things carefully and pay attention to the details that other people skipped. Turned out that was enough. It had always been enough. The bar referral against Caden had concluded in March. The Michigan State Bar found sufficient grounds for a formal reprimand and a 60-day suspension of his license, effective immediately. Edmund called me with the news the way he delivered everything, as information, not a verdict. Caden had not contested it. According to Petra, he had accepted the outcome quietly and spent his suspension volunteering with a legal aid clinic on the west side of the city. I held that information without deciding anything. People surprised you sometimes. The trick was not letting your guard down before the surprise had time to prove it was real. My father had not contacted me since the Sunday morning phone call in December. That silence had a texture I was still learning to inhabit. For most of my life, my father's attention, even his negative attention, his corrections and dismissals and public performances of my inadequacy, had been a constant presence, a kind of weather I had organized my interior life around. Without it, the space felt strange at first. Open in a way I didn't entirely know what to do with. Then gradually it started to feel like the sunroom on Birchwood Lane before I turned the heat on. Cold, yes, but also full of possibility. My mother came on the first real Saturday of spring, mid-April, the kind of day where the temperature climbs above 60 and everyone in the city responds by being outside. She brought tulip bulbs, 2 paper bags of them, and came through the front gate with her coat open and a slightly uncertain expression. A woman arriving somewhere familiar under entirely new terms. I met her on the porch steps. We hugged. She smelled like the same soap she'd used my entire life, and I felt for a moment how long I had wanted a version of this that was simply honest. We spent the morning in the garden. She knew where things went. She had spent years in this yard beside my grandmother, and her hands moved through the soil with a muscle memory I hadn't expected. We worked side by side along the front walk, pressing bulbs into the beds at the right depth and spacing, and we talked in the way people talk when their hands are busy. Not about the hardest things directly but around them, approaching from the side, which is sometimes the only way to get close without everything shutting down. She told me that she and my father were separating. Not with drama, not with lawyers yet, just with the quiet, deliberate acknowledgement that 35 years of a particular arrangement had come to a natural and overdue end. She said it without bitterness and without performance, the way you describe something that has already happened internally long before it happens on paper. I looked at her hands in the soil. I asked her if she was okay. She said for the first time in a long time, genuinely yes. She said she had started seeing a therapist in February. The therapist had told her something in their third session that she had been thinking about ever since. That silence in a relationship is not always neutral. Sometimes silence is the loudest form of agreement. She had been silent for 35 years and she was done calling it peace. We planted all the bulbs by noon. Then we sat on the porch with tea and sandwiches and watched a pair of sparrows work the birch trees along the walk, carrying things, building something in the upper branches. My mother told me about a ceramics class she had started in January, something she had wanted to do for 20 years and never did because my father found hobby-level creative pursuits mildly embarrassing. He had made a bowl. It was lopsided and she loved it completely. I told her I wanted to see it. She said she would bring it next time. And the assumption of a next time, said simply and without ceremony, was the thing that made my throat tight. Before she left, she stopped in the front hallway and looked at the house the way people look at places that hold a long history of complicated feeling. She said, "Your grandmother would have liked this. Not just you being here. The way you've made it yours." I thanked her. She squeezed my hand at the door and walked back down the porch steps toward her car. At the gate she turned around once. "I'm going to keep trying," she said. I nodded. "I know, Mom." "Me too." That evening I sat at the oak desk I had moved into the back room of the house, the room that had been my grandfather's study and that I had slowly converted into a home office. Books on one wall, plant samples and design references on the other. The window looking out onto the back garden where the peony shoots were now 6 inches tall and climbing. I had a project deadline in 2 days and I worked steadily through the early evening with the satisfaction of someone doing exactly what they are supposed to be doing in exactly the place they are supposed to be doing it. Around 9 I stopped and made tea and took it out to the back porch. The April night was cold still but cleanly so, the kind of cold that feels like weather rather than winter. The garden was dark but I knew what was in it. I had put it there myself, or I was putting it there layer by layer, season by season, the way my grandmother had. It occurred to me, standing there with my tea going warm in my hands, that this was what she had actually given me. Not the house or the money, though those things were real and they had changed the practical shape of my life in ways I was still mapping. What she had given me was a model. A demonstration carried out over decades, of what it looks like to build something on your own terms without needing anyone to raise a glass about it. She had run a business and nobody called it a business. She had accumulated everything quietly and nobody noticed. She had loved a man and lost him and built her life anyway and told no one until she was ready. She had planned for her own death with the same practical care she gave to everything else and made sure the person she trusted most was protected before she left. I was 28 years old. I had a house my grandmother built, a business I was building myself, and a coat pocket full of letters from a woman who had believed in me before I had learned to believe in myself. My father was in an apartment across town, telling whoever would listen a story where he was the wronged party. My brother was serving a suspension and slowly figuring out who he was without my father's instructions. My mother was making a lopsided bowl in a ceramics class and calling it something to be proud of. And somewhere out there, Dorothea Crane was going about her life carrying the quiet knowledge that her friend's final act had landed exactly the way it was supposed to. I finished my tea. I went back inside. I locked the front door of my grandmother's house. My house, and for the first time in a very long time, the click of the lock sounded exactly like what it was. Not an ending. Not a closing off. Just a woman at the end of a long day coming home. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional, real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.